I have spent most of my career working in huge software companies, solving some of the toughest problems for some of the biggest companies in the world. But when I read about product management today, it strikes me that a lot of the discussion is around startups, around internet-based consumer products, which I find really interesting. It gives me insight into another set of challenges. But today I thought I would talk about doing product management in the enterprise. Hi, I'm Greg with Prickrell Consulting, where we do product strategy for the enterprise. And that begs this question, what is the enterprise? Well, technically, we're talking about B2B. You're selling to a business instead of a person. But the connotation is usually that there's a lot of scale, that we're solving big problems for lots of people. What kinds of problems? I've helped clients work on systems that, for example, provided communications for airports or railways. I've seen companies that are trying to map the entire Earth. Other companies are building the systems that control the lighting, the air conditioning and heating in the biggest buildings in the world. So some of these problems may not seem like they have a lot of sizzle, but somebody's got to solve them. And that brings me to the first point I'd like to make about the difference between working in the enterprise maybe and working in a lot of consumer-oriented products. And that is just the complexity of the problem and the complexity of the solution that's required. So I spent most of my time doing software product management, but to solve these big problems, very often a single piece of software isn't sufficient. There's several pieces of software that have to work together. There may be a lot of hardware, and very often you need services. You need people that can help customers install it, maintain it, operate it. So the nature of the solution that we provide is much more complex. The next point has to do with the term customer, which we throw around all over the place. Understand the customer, have empathy for the customer, know your customer. But in the enterprise space, the term customer is just kind of a conversational convenience, because behind that term are a bunch of different, what I call archetypes or customer stakeholders. There's the person who's going to buy it, which may be the CEO. There's the person who's going to make the decision about whether or not it gets bought. There are all types of end users, the people who are managing end users. There are administrators. So as a product manager, we have to think about all of them. And by the way, sometimes their requirements are conflicting. If you make one happy, you will kind of annoy the other one. The next point I would make, it has to do with the buying process. So in the consumer space, people do research when they buy things, but we also make purchases just kind of on impulse, which is something that just doesn't happen in the enterprise space. Typically, big companies have stockholders and they have very rigorous buying processes. So that very often means that they're going to look at a bunch of vendors, they're going to compare them, and it may come down to, based on a certain set of requirements, competing on price, which isn't a lot of fun. So in the enterprise space, there's really not this idea of an impulse buy. You've really got to understand what the company needs, how their buying process works, and make sure that your business model, your pricing model, conform to that. And that brings me to the last point, which is related to the idea that there's a rigorous buying process, and that has to do with the length of the sales cycle. It may be hard to believe, but in the enterprise space, it may take 2 years to sell something, or 18 months to sell something. Or if you, from the time you contact a customer to the time you sell them, do it in 6 months, that may be a huge success. So the length of the sales process is much greater. So the enterprise doesn't always sound like it has a lot of sizzle. Those problems have to be solved, and I hope I've given you some insight into some of the key challenges that product managers on the other end of the spectrum face in solving those problems.